welcome then to this session on Black Lives Matter, on the protest movement that has really covered and changed the world in these last 2 months. These protests have brought to the center of the public agenda the still pervasiveness and centrality of racism in our society and the centrality of colonialism in our society, and has changed the way we think and we talked in ways that were unthinkable 2 months ago. I mean, it's a movement that has really had an impact that we need to sit and think, because it has completely changed public discourses and politics. And it is going to keep changing, hopefully, public discourse and politics. And with us today, we have 3 panelists, which are experts and are going to talk with us about their views and their thoughts about these questions. I'm going to introduce them, and then they are each going to talk for about 10 minutes or so. And then we will open the floor for questions and answers. As a rule of method, please, if you have questions, write them on the Q&A window. I will collect them and pass them on to the speakers. So the 3 speakers today, and I will introduce them in the order that they will present, are first Adia Harvey Winfield, who is the Mary Tailstone Hemingway Professor in Arts and Sciences and Associate Dean for Faculty Development at Washington University in St. Louis. She is also the President-elect of the Southern Sociological Society and the recipient of the 2018 Public Understanding of Sociology Award from the American Sociological Association. The second speaker today will be Frederick Wherry, who is the Townsend Martin Class of 1917 Professor of Sociology at Princeton University and the Director of the Dignity and Depth Network. He's the past President of the Social Science History Association and the past Chair of the Economic Sociology section of the American Sociological Association. And the first speaker is Zophia Edwards, who is Assistant Professor at Providence College. So now I will leave the floor to them. They will each speak for about 10 minutes or so. Please, again, questions in the Q&A window, and I look forward to this conversation. Adia, the floor is yours.
Great, thank you, Jose, and thank you to Itzigsohn for inviting me to be a part of this panel. Thanks to everybody who's listening and present for this session. I was invited to talk about Black Lives Matter and given pretty broad guidelines around what that meant. So I wanted to frame my remarks around thinking about the implications that I think Black Lives Matter has for certain areas of systemic change in this country. And there are a couple of areas that I think it's important to be mindful of when we think about the impact that Black Lives Matter could have. My work tends to focus more on racial and gender inequality in professional occupations. I'm not a social movement scholar, so that's not really the area that I feel the most capable of thinking about the implications of the movement. But I do think that it is useful to weigh and consider how the Black Lives Matter movement at large has the potential to reframe a lot of our discussions around certain issues, but also potential limitations and liabilities that certain institutions and organizations in our society can have if perhaps they heed the messages of Black Lives Matter in ways that don't necessarily create optimal outcomes and opportunities for communities of color. One thing that I think is important to be mindful of is how, when we talk about how the goals of Black Lives Matter are framed, and this central question of the importance of elevating Black lives to equal footing with whites as part of the majority group in US society, I think it's critical and necessary to be mindful also of how intersecting factors have an impact on the experiences that are there for various Black lives. I wrote about this maybe about 10 years ago or so for a piece for Pacific Standard, where I discussed the importance of gendering the Black Lives Matter movement. And this isn't to say that the movement, the people who instituted the movement and the original thinkers on this term were blind to this issue. Rather, I think it's important that as people who can listen and learn from the Black Lives movement, that we make sure to be cognizant of the ways in which intersections of gender, class, sexual identity, and so forth matter in terms of shaping how Black Lives matter and what that means concretely in terms of various facets of Black experience. So for example, when I wrote this piece for Pacific Standard, we were talking a lot at that time period about extralegal violence towards mostly Black men. I think the Trayvon Martin case had happened around that time period. We were having a lot of discussions about the consistency and the frequency of Black men being killed by police and by regular citizens who aren't representatives of the state. But I think we've come a long way in terms of having more discussion now about how that's gendered in ways that mean that Black women are also likely to experience this violence, but often erased from the narratives and the conversations that we have about the implications of these extrajudicial and extralegal killings. Kimberly Williams Crenshaw's Say Her Name movement has really been fundamental in pushing us to talk more about the ways in which women are victims of state violence, whether that's in terms of shootings like what we saw with Breonna Taylor, or what we hear less about, which I think are examples of sexual violence towards Black women from police and representatives of the state. The Daniel Holtzclaw case, for example, I think is a useful and instructive site for interrogating how Black women can be particularly subject to certain forms of state violence in ways that reflect these intersections of race and gender and class. And if you're unfamiliar with this case, this was a police officer in Oklahoma that was eventually convicted for raping and sexually assaulting mostly Black women in his jurisdiction. So I think that it's useful for us to be mindful of how this movement pushes us to be attuned to the ways that Black lives certainly matter on a broad scale, but the importance of being mindful of not simply painting with such a broad brush that we erase the experiences of women of color, Black women in particular, working class Black women, Black LGBTQ women, and so forth, people who are non-binary, who are femme-presenting, and so forth. The second area that I think is important to be mindful of has to do with how organizations can learn from Black Lives Matter, but still not fully learn the lessons and not fully internalize them. And I say this as someone who's done extensive work on race and gender in organizational settings, and particularly been attuned to how many organizations today are trying to modify and adapt to this new moment and new environment in which we find ourselves. And I have talked a lot and thought a lot about how we see that shifting and what the implications of that shift are. What I mean by that is that we now are in this moment where it's more common to hear a lot of organizations saying that they support Black Lives Matter and that they are opposed to systemic racism and that they stand against racism and so forth, which is really ironic in some cases when we look at the organizations making those statements, that if you look at some of their organizational practices have actually been engaging in some pretty systemic racism, as evidenced by some of their labor practices, the inequalities within their organizations, particularly in leadership and so forth. It's a lot easier to black out your Instagram and post a cool hashtag than it is to do the internal work of considering what sort of organizational practices may actually be perpetuating the things that you purport to decry and downplay. And one of the things that worries me as a researcher who studies work in organizations is that many companies may say the right things, but go about the work of doing this very dangerously and in ways that perpetuate these inequalities. In my most recent book, which is a study of Black healthcare workers Black professional healthcare workers in that industry, one of the most important and interesting findings that I think came out of it was that in many cases, Black professional workers find themselves tasked with, they find themselves in organizations that say some similar things. Yes, we believe in diversity. Yes, we want to have more racial diversity and we want to be an organization that appeals to a wide array of communities of color. Great, that's fantastic. This is where our organization should be today. But what often happens in practice is that those organizations do not couple that commitment with resources. Instead, what they do is they leave that work up to Black professionals and their employ, who are often underrepresented in those positions in the first place. So what ends up occurring is that many organizations offer this stated commitment to racial diversity and support for workers and communities of color. But when it comes to actually doing the labor and doing the work of making their organizations available to and amenable to these communities, that becomes the job of the few Black professionals in that organization, effectively taxing those workers with doing an additional job on top of the ones for which they are already hired. To me, that is an untenable situation for the long term. It does not bode well for the Black workers in those organizational settings, and it does not bode well for those institutions being able to effectively bridge the gaps between themselves and the communities of color that they purport to serve. So I really hope that as we think about where Black Lives Matter has the potential to take us, and that as we are attuned to some of the pitfalls that may be present as a consequence of people not fully endorsing or moving forward with the movement, we're mindful of the ways that organizations have incredible power to advance these goals, but only if they do so in a way that really critically interrogates the ways in which many of their practices have been built on these systemic ideas, and that they don't avoid doing the difficult but necessary work of making those changes and simply resort to leaving that work up to a handful of Black workers who may really be truly committed to this idea of Black Lives Mattering, but don't necessarily have the organizational resources to put that into practice. I'll stop there. Thank you.
So,
Jose, I think you're muted.
okay. I'm sorry, I was muted. I tried to unmute myself. Thank you, Adia, for your words. Fred, the floor is yours. And sorry.
Okay, thank you. So I'll be pretty brief and at times pretty blunt. So after a flawed study made the rounds across the newspapers here in the US, Wall Street Journal, a number of TV stations, etc., reporting no racial differences in police violence in the US, some researchers, Dean Knox and Jonathan Momolo, decided to look at the data that was being used and noticed a very basic flaw, what we call sampling on the dependent variable. And then they themselves reran the data, did some other things, and found that Black males are 2.5 times more likely to have a lethal encounter with the police compared with white males. And so the question for me, of course, seeing that, you know, when you see 2.5 times sort of lethal encounters, you have to ask why. And as an economic sociologist and a cultural sociologist, the first place that my mind went to was on the question of how are Black lives being valued? And so as I was asking this question of value, and you know, I was almost moving into a sort of, why are some lives priceless and others not? Why is it that some people can shoot up an entire church and somehow come out alive, and others do very little and are quickly dead? I landed in three places. The first was a basic network story that I'll tell quickly. It's not work that I've done, but Andy Papachristos and others. The second is a question of moral hazard. And this is a sort of a classic problem with organizations, and it's one that we see with the police. And here I'll lean on the work of Rashawn Ray, who's at University of Maryland, and who has written about this at the Brookings Institute. And finally, there's a cultural economic question. And so here the question is, who cares and who counts the cost of racism? Now, so let me start out with the easiest one, the network story. And though there's selection effects, the basic story is this: violence spreads through networks, and just as researchers were looking at the spread of violence through networks when studying gang violence, they've turned that lens using administrative data onto the police. And what they've done, of course, is they've simply shown that if you are connected or connected to someone who's connected with someone who, a police officer who has committed violence, then you are sort of at a higher risk of committing violence. And we can imagine sort of the various socialization and other pressures that are there that allow someone to start to sort of see danger where it does not exist. And so here you're seeing violence spread. And so again, not my work, Andy Papachristos and others. The other thing that we can say about the about networks is looking at a recent piece in criminology by Michael Sierra Arevalo. And one of the things that Michael does is he asks questions about sort of why do people see danger where it doesn't exist. And so this was based on embedding himself in a number of different police departments, going through police training. And one of the things, of course, that happens is that that you're being trained to sort of see a gun in the unlikeliest of places. And this kind of training, I remember sort of it's myself. It was the summer of the LA riots. A month after the last building was burning, I landed in LA to work at to intern with the Sheriff's Department, their public information bureau. And I got to sort of see how cadets were being trained, and what I saw is something that Sierra Arevalo talks about is you go through these trainings and someone's sort of reaching into a pocket, they're reaching towards a pillow, they're reaching into sort of pretty innocent looking places, and out comes a gun. And you need to be ready to sort of shoot to kill or you will be killed. And so there's that kind of effect, both of networks, but also based on routines. The second thing is this question of moral hazard. So you're in a police department, your officers are engaged in lethal force on 2 regular bases, and the city is having to pay out a settlement, millions of dollars at a time. This is not hurting the police department at all. There's no hard budget constraint. It is not affecting the police liability insurance. And in fact, the only thing that happens is you get more attention because you are the squeaky wheel that needs the oil. And so you have this perverse effect of there being no real budget constraint and an increasing need to sort of pour resources toward the kinds of work that you're doing. And some of those resources are poured towards things like de-escalation training. But one of the difficulties is that even where we see de-escalation training well in place, as in Minnesota, we don't see de-escalation being practiced in particular kinds of encounters. Okay, and then the final thing I think that we should keep in mind is this question of who cares and who counts. Who cares about the cost of racism? And as much as we want to critique the police, I mean, we should critique all of our institutions and our various disciplinary traditions, because often the real culprit is not, we're told it's not race. We're told racism is hard to measure, so don't bother. We're told that the real violence is the violence of class. And this is not to say that class doesn't matter. But what it does do then is that explanations that sometimes lead with race and racism are often sternly put back into their place. And I think that sometimes happens because sometimes some of the work around race and racism sounds too much like culture and too little like structure. And based on the tastes and subfields of various disciplines, that just renders it unviable. In any event, it is hard to care about the cost of racism if class is the only thing that counts or the only thing that gets enumerated in our administrative data. or in our national surveys. And so this becomes one of those ongoing problems of it would be nice to know if race matters, but we can't get that data for sort of financial institutions and banking. We can't get that data for a range of outcomes that we care about. And that's something that requires fixing. And so I'll just, as a last word, say, I think we have things that we can contribute to this debate. And I mean, one of the most basic things we can contribute is just getting the numbers right, getting the analytics right, but also opening up space for understanding what are the key factors and key variables that we are willing to see. And if they're not already being assessed, then I'm getting very serious about assessing them. So thank you.
Thank you, Fred. And Zophia, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jose, and thank you to Nitzan for organizing and the other presenters for amazing comments so far. When I was asked to contribute to this panel as a comparative and historical sociologist, the first thing that always jumps into my mind is this happening everywhere, elsewhere, and is this new? And so my comments are kind of around those two questions and thinking about Black movements around the world and also historically. So, I mean, by now we know that Black Lives Matter is a global movement, right? People all over the world, particularly Black people, are grieving the murder of George Floyd, and they're connecting it to state-sanctioned violence against Black people and Indigenous people and brown people within their own immediate borders. So that this movement has taken off across the globe is not surprising to us here, because we recognize there's a shared historical logic of global racial capitalism at work, a global color line, as Du Bois called it, which has rendered the Black body a target of state-sanctioned violence all over the world. You know, anti-Blackness is global and grounded in the creation of race and racism and the super exploitation of the Black body, especially the Black woman's body. So the undervaluing of Black life is global and historical, and it's always been linked to questions around racism and labor. So this movement itself is part of, in that context, a long history of global Black social movements that has forced the world to imagine something radically different, right? To imagine different social relations and a different political economy. In this brief 10 minutes that I have, I just want to survey a couple examples of this Black radical imagination, as authors like Robin Kelley and Robeson Taj Fraser have called it, and how this imagination and action has shifted the trajectory of the global political economy. And I hope that by drawing on this kind of global, historical, relational, dialectical thinking, that we could situate Black Lives Matter into the history of Black resistance, rebellion, and internationalism. And I hope we can then sort of appreciate both the feat and the fear around the current Black Lives Matter movement. So my first example is the Haitian Revolution. The Haitian Revolution, which successfully birthed the first independent Black republic and the first democracy in the Western Hemisphere, shook the world. I mean, this was inconceivable, impossible to the people of the time, certainly to white capital and labor. The brutal, cruel, sadistic violence inflicted upon Black workers in order to generate enormous capital and great wealth in Europe has been detailed, particularly in C.L.R. James's Black Jacobins, so I won't go over it here. But after almost 15 years of struggle, where enslaved people battled for their emancipation, for racial equality, and independence from colonial rule, Haitians totally transformed that society and brought forth something new in an Atlantic world dominated by Europeans and the transatlantic slave trade and plantation slavery. This rocked the world and changed the globe. It was a blow to the gut of both capital accumulation and white supremacist ideology, as white capital and labor were forced to imagine a world with free Black people. And for them, it was a source of acute fear and paranoia and terror. But it was also a source of great admiration and inspiration for other Black people in the region and around the world, and stimulated anti-colonial and anti-slavery movements across the hemisphere and the world. So the Haitian imagination and agency reoriented the global political economy. They damaged French imperialism and badly wounded the French economy. With this opening, the British increased and extended their imperial tentacles in the region. And as sugar production increased for the British, so too did its devotion to the exploitation of Black labor. And settler colonialism in the US was extended as they bought Louisiana from the injured French. So Haiti really altered the trajectory of global capitalism and was punished, severely punished, for daring to imagine, for daring to create a free Black republic. And those Black liberation struggles continued. My second example of the Black radical imagination and how it shaped the global political economy is Black worker movements in the interwar years. Those movements changed the definition of who is a worker and advanced ideas about Black freedom from colonial rule. After emancipation, racialized workers in colonized territories continued to occupy the lowest rungs of the labor structure in the global capitalist system. And as such, were precluded from accessing the same rights and privileges as white workers in Europe. The pervading racial ideology continued to cite cultural backwardness and genetic makeup of African and African descended people as necessitating intervention and upliftment by colonial powers. And that, now that slavery was abolished, new techniques of direct coercion were required to make people with little interest in labor work for public and private employers, right? Supposedly little interest. So after emancipation, colonizers compelled colonial subjects to work through taxation policies, compulsory labor laws, apprenticeship laws, vagrancy regulations, conscriptions by empowered chiefs, indentured service contracts, land dispossession, all in order to create a permanent dependent laboring class, which could extract to the extreme from Black workers, particularly Black women workers. So given this enormous profits, it would be antithetical for European capital and states to increase wages and work for workers in the colonies as they were for workers in the metropole. So workers, Black workers, under the threat of war, bombs, obscene amounts of violence and brutal repression, fought, they organized, they went on strike, they protested, they warred in order to be free of worker oppression and racism, sexism and imperialism and colonial rule. So indeed, this was a fight for total transformation. And they forced these colonizers to reimagine who is a worker, who is a human, what is nation, what is independence, what is anti-capitalism and self-determination. These movements forced colonizers to alter their approach to Black labor around the world. And as they did so during this period, these colonizers then turned to new techniques of domination, right? And we see neocolonialism, techniques of neocolonialism and structures of neocolonialism emerging. But they also ushered in a wave of Black power decolonization movements. And so those liberation struggles persisted. And so now we are here with Black Lives Matter. And broadly speaking, this movement seeks to end state-sanctioned violence against Black people. In the era of neoliberalism, we are still dealing with this question of racism and labor. And how can capital still keep accumulating? And so people commonly recognize Black Lives Matter's concern with police brutality and criminal justice reform, but less widely acknowledged is that the movement also centers a broader set of racial injustices, including economic injustice, Black immigration, LGBTQIA+ and human rights issues, environmental injustice, access to healthcare and quality education, and voting rights and voting suppression. So therefore, this is a holistic movement that is not just about granting greater political economic power, but calling for a transformation. And as part of that vision, on the, if you go to their website, they say they want to create a space for Black imagination and innovation by calling for defunding the police and dismantling criminal justice system. Black Lives Matter wants the world to imagine life without the police, life without structural racism, right? It is delegitimizing the US imperial project, calling into question military spending, right? It's calling for new ways of existing and interacting and new ways of living. And they're doing so in the face of this invisible killer, COVID-19, which is disproportionately affecting them, disproportionately taking lives. I'll just quote Melina Abdullah, who's the leader of Black Lives Matter in Los Angeles, who says, "We pray that we don't get sick, but if we do, it is what it is, because my children are under greater threat by these officers who kill people than they are by COVID-19. So Black Lives Matter, what we are witnessing today is part of a long history of Black radical politics based on radical imagination and radical innovation. And drawing on long-standing traditions, these people are facing death to liberate themselves, ourselves, to alter the world in ways never before seen and create a new and different reality. But the question now is, what will result? What will be created? Right? In true dialectical fashion, every successful global Black liberation movement historically was met with innovation in racialized capitalism, with new forms of repressive apparatus and novel ways of extracting surplus from Black bodies. So as we study these movements, I think it's equally important that we study the backlash, how racial capitalism gets reinvented and finds new and creative ways to extract and exploit. So we can't sleep, we can never rest. And I'll just end, I'm from the Caribbean, so I'll just end with a quote by Bob Marley, which I think really encapsulates why we cannot sleep and we cannot rest in this moment. So Bob Marley, when he, in response to why he would persist and still perform in a free concert, just 2 days after an assassination attempt where he got shot in the arm, he said, "The people who are trying to make this world worse are not taking the day off. Why should I?" And that's it.
Thank you very much, Zophia. There are now a few questions that people have posed. I will make one round of questions and then people can keep writing questions in the Q&A if you have them. So I will pose them to you and you can take whichever question you want in whichever order you want. So there is one question asking the panelists to reflect on how the movement is stronger, weaker in different parts of the US. This is a question from somebody not based in the US. A second question related, following Zophia's historical imagination, is it useful to compare the 2014 wave of protest and today? What are the differences and what we can learn from them? For Adia, what would be the equivalence of Black Lives Matter in the workplace? How can organizations move beyond diversity training to something that resembles defunding the police? And for Fred, in addition to the moral hazard example, Are there other institutional examples by which killing, particularly blacks, is not costly and even beneficial for the police? So those are the questions so far. You can take them in any order you want. Since you went last, Sophia, you want to start now? Let's go in reverse order.
Okay, great. Yes, I think it is. We can always learn something from exploring, going and studying movements that have happened in the past. And I think it's like I go back to the Haitian Revolution, which was 15 years in its height of struggle, right? So these things, I think what we are seeing is that it doesn't happen overnight. It's years and years of struggle that, each protest, each wave of protest kind of builds the momentum to something else. And so in 2014, when I think we saw one of the turning points I think that we saw was Black people always knew there was a problem, but in 2014, at least some of the data shows that suddenly white Americans started saying, I think this might be a problem. And so we see a change in sort of the broader American public discourse around the issue of Black lives and the Black Lives Matter movement and the legitimacy of the Black Lives Matter movement. So I do think that, we see with every iteration, the changes in the public discourse, changes in white responses. And now we're in this moment where, as Adia talked about, where now corporations are saying, oh yeah, we have a problem, but it remains, what are they gonna do about that? So we'll have to watch and see.
Yes, it looks like I'm next up. One of the things that I want to make sure that I not do is not give the impression that somehow there's this organization of police officers who really believe that they can kill with impunity and are sort of seeing sort of in very stark terms benefits of killing. And I want to make sure that I do that in part because borrowing from Goffman, one of the things that makes a performance effective is that the actors themselves believe in the parts that they are playing. And so without sort of inferring any kinds of cynical motives on the part of most police officers, I want to sort of first put out there that I think one of the ways that that they have been so effective and so immune to public criticism is that they themselves believe in the parts that they are playing, and they're able to sort of relay that sincerity of belief. I think the other thing to keep in mind is when you're thinking about sort of the benefits of killing. So what the police are trying to demonstrate is that they are upholding order and that they are sort of a bulwark against chaos. And so when you have this symbolic binary between order and chaos, sometimes people can be very forgiving about how order gets made. And so this is why I think as we think about the effectiveness of movements, we have to be very clear about the difference between a movement's capacity and a movement's reception. We also have to be clear about the various organizations that are counted under the umbrella of the movement. So if you talk to Black Lives Matter activists, they will tell you that there are a number of organizations. There's the Movement for Black Lives. There's, so they're not all the same. They have different capacities depending on where they are located, and their work has resonated in different ways. So it's, on the one hand, they've got their own capacities. On the other hand, there's this other thing of resonance, and some of that resonance has then been taken up by the media and then amplified. And so when this is happening in real time, it's very hard to sort of track it in real time and say that we sort of know something about sort of inherent capacities by region, and we know something about why we're seeing resonance and amplification from some sites and not other sites. I think with that, I will sort of stop talking for a while because Adia can say much more.
Thank you. It looks like I actually have two questions on the Q&A that are somewhat related. One person asks about how organizations can move beyond diversity training to something that resembles defunding the police. I think, and I wrote about this recently for Harvard Business Review using my own department as an example. I think that there are ways that organizations can move towards building much more racially diverse workplaces and departments and settings, but this has to involve a couple of key things. I think it has to involve leadership support, active and intentional leadership support. It has to involve resources, and it has to involve an explicit intentional commitment to racial diversity. And that may seem a little bit intuitive and self-evident, but what we find with the research is that in many cases, organizations say that they want to create more diversity, but that becomes used as a very broad umbrella term that then shifts to ambiguous things like diversity of thought or diversity of opinion or diversity of viewpoints. And ultimately, when organizations commit that broadly, what they end up doing is ignoring and sidestepping the systemic processes that lead to the underrepresentation of Black workers in the workforce, particularly at high levels. So I think those three things are key towards moving away from this issue of diversity training, which we know does not really work to move the needle, towards actually establishing a clear commitment to more racial diversity in a workplace. The second question that I see here has to do with a person whose experiences have been to move away from hiring Black workers because of the presumption that if they have to fire that person, it will always be considered racism, as opposed to the real reason that the person is let go. And I think that speaks to some of these issues about the difficulty of trying to do this work when there's not an explicit sustained commitment to more racial diversity explicitly. If you work in an organization where your focus is on creating a workspace that is truly and genuinely racially diverse, that includes Black workers, Latinx workers, Asian Americans, and so forth, then part of that commitment also has to include thinking about what your organization might be doing that makes it an unwelcoming or hostile space for those communities of color. And some of that might be assuming that if those workers get fired, that it's always going to be a racism problem. That may in fact be the case, but it's a big jump to decide that if that worker gets fired, they're always going to assume that it's racism and then taking the preemptive step to not hire that worker in the first place. I'd also add that if you are an organization that does have a robust diversity, or that does have robust racial diversity within the organization, that also can lead to the inclusion and involvement of a variety of voices, such that it becomes a lot easier for workers of color to be fully integrated and part of that organization than if they just have to be the one worker in a space where people didn't want to hire them in the first place because they thought that they were simply going to be a problem if they got fired, because they would assume that racism was the issue. So I think in answer to the second question about what Black Lives Matter means for the workplace, I think it means not just raising numbers, and there are strategies for how organizations can do that, but I think it also means taking stock of the culture and environment where people are hired into and making sure that those spaces are ones where people can truly thrive and flourish. And often that's an additional step that doesn't get done in many organizational settings.
Thank you, Adia. There are a few more questions that the attendants have written in the Q&A. For Fred, they're asking you to elaborate on your point that race is considered too cultural of an explanation. Is this by other sociologists? And then there are a couple of related questions. One that asks, what potential policy or policy changes at the federal level do you see as having a positive impact, as creating real change? And related, do you think there will be real changes, or will it be back to more of the same? So the floor is open for whoever wants to take these questions.
Oh, yes, culture. So one of the challenges with thinking about sort of the Black Lives Matter movement and the question of culture versus structure, et cetera, is that much of it depends on the outcomes that we're directly concerned about. And here I'm going to be a very boring person and say that the kinds of things that one needs to do when thinking about lethal force being disproportionately applied to Black people, that's going to be a different set of prescriptions than what we're going to see when we're thinking about a more just world and what's happening in corporate and non-corporate settings. The other thing that I will sort of do is make a pledge not to call any specific names when thinking about the other sociologists and others who sort of will be very insistent on this question of everything is somehow if we just get this sort of some of these socio-economic class-based variables in the right place, everything else will take care of itself. There are a number of people who make that claim, and you know who you are. So I don't need to call your name. I have enough names to call here at home. And so the last thing I'll say on this point is that there's been a lot of work already done under the last U.S. administration of Obama. They brought together people who do this for a living and legal scholars like Tracy Mears and others, and they actually came up with sort of federal level recommendations for how to make policing more accountable. They were also very concerned about sort of how hard it is to get access to the administrative data that would tell us. Do you have police officers who have already been already left one job somewhere else because of use of force, and now they're in your precinct? Do you have a sort of a little niche of folks there who are very happy to sort of engage in roughing up and shooting in Black and brown communities? Those are information. Some of that is an information fix and a transparency fix, and it's already been proposed, and then it was, but not done. So there are some very clear things that people have spent lots of time thinking about how to fix, and we just haven't done it.
I can jump in about if we think there'll be real change or more of the same. I'm really observing what's going on right now in terms of the responses. I think in this particular moment with COVID-19, what we have been hearing from organizations, I will talk about higher education because that's where I am. That's where I'm employed. We want to do it. We are committed. We want to end structural racism on this campus, but we don't have the money now. It's COVID-19. We can't hire. We have to freeze hiring, and we can't, right? So I think that this goes back to sort of what Adia was saying in the beginning, which is that there have been a lot of public statements about committing to change, but when it's time to put the money where their mouth is, we're not seeing that. At least in higher education, we're not seeing that. We're not seeing the commitment. And so I think there will be a lot more protests, and I think there will be a lot more struggle in order to get more. But in this particular moment right now, I think there is a lot of resistance. Even if we look more broadly outside of higher education, the entire discourse around what is going on in the global political economy right now is how can we get back? How can we get back to school? How can we get back to work? It's back, but back to neoliberal policies, right? Back to racism. Like this is, so we are not imagining, at least our, you know, leaders and so on, they're not imagining restructuring the economy in any significant way. They want to go back to how things used to be. So I think there'll be a lot more struggle. I think this is just, we're just in the beginnings, we're in the middle of it. But there'll be a lot more to push before we get to where we want to be, or closer to where we want to be.
That was my phone, sorry.
I was just going to say that I agree with what Zophia just said. It's interesting. I've been talking with older people about how they see this moment compared to the civil rights movement, which I guess was a recent kind of comparable moment in terms of these public, visible discussions around these types of issues. And most of the older people that I've talked to have said that something feels different about this moment. They're likely to say that there seem to be a lot more young people involved. There seem to be a lot more people of different races involved. The civil rights movement predated me. I wasn't around for it, so I'll take them at their word about that. But I don't know, sometimes the cynic in me takes a long view of American history and wonders if this is the moment that we finally get it right, or this is the moment that we do what we've continued to do in American history, which is to make progress but not create equity. And we've not ever gotten to that point in America. We have had progress, and I think that's indisputable, but we have not ever gotten to a point where we've been able to achieve actual full racial equity for Black Americans. And there have been opportunities where we could have done a lot of things differently to get to that point, and it's never happened due to a variety and a confluence of factors. So I don't know if I am quite as sanguine as some of my my older people that I talk to, and even they, I shouldn't misrepresent. They're not representing to me that they think, okay, this is the time when finally we get to that point, and you know, this is the turning point. I don't know that I feel that way either, simply because in America, I think we have a long history of 2 steps forward to take 1 step back. So I am optimistic to the degree that I think that it's useful and helpful that we are having these explicit conversations and these discussions at this point right now. But I think it's hard to have any more than, I guess, veiled hope, given that we have not historically as a country done a good job in creating the equity that we should be. And we know that historically we haven't ever fully managed to surmount these issues. So I wonder if this is yet another period of time where we do make some advancements that are necessary and useful, but we stop short of fully addressing and acknowledging and doing the difficult work of putting forth the resources that it would take to really create a racially equitable society for Black Americans and for other people of color.
Thank you, Adia. There are 4 more questions and not so much time, so I will put them and you can take whichever you want. Mainly for Zophia, how do you think Black Lives Matter can build alliances with people groups concerned with other forms of racism, especially in Europe? Another question, given that the crises created by COVID-19 are likely to go on and intensify over years rather than months, how might the duration of crisis affect the ability to sustain interest and political efficacy of movements like Black Lives Matter? Third question, what role can labor unions play? Are labor unions playing in these struggles? And finally, and this is one that interests me, how Black Lives Matter is going to change your own research, if at all. Does it change your theoretical or empirical orientation in any way? So we have 4 questions. You can take whichever you want, 1 more round, as we have like 6 more minutes. So who wants to go first? Zophia.
Okay, for the question about collaborating and building alliances with other groups. I think that Black Lives Matter, the Black Lives Matter organization is doing this work. I know, as Fred was saying, there are different organizations also involved, but I do know that the one that was started by Alicia Garza and her, you know, the Black Lives Matter organization, they have, for instance, explicitly stated that they are, you know, working with Palestinians for Palestinian liberation, for example. So there are concrete international ties between these groups, because they're, and also as part of their mandate, they do work on Black immigration issues as well, or crimmigration, right? Criminalization of immigration and Blackness. And so I think that, yeah, you're absolutely right. There is international alliances, and international cooperation is definitely a part of what is also enabling this movement to grow into this global force.
Fred?
Yeah, so just quickly, ironically, I think it's COVID-19 that allowed Black Lives Matter to catch fire. When you have a lot of people who suddenly are at home, you are able to then have a focus of attention around particular kinds of issues that you would not have had otherwise. What this will mean going forward, I'm not sure. But what I think we do know is that having what my former real estate agent called the Great Pause, where all transactions ceased, etc., allowed that focus of attention and allowed people to have the time really to go and do the protests in the streets. Labor unions, I think we have to keep in mind that the police are in a labor union, and as we critique the police and the police unions, we need to be careful about sort of the general language that we bring to this discussion about the efficacy of unions. And I think the final thing on the changing of how I conduct my work, I would like to think that if you stay ready, you don't have to suddenly get ready. And so I think a number of us have been doing work that is in alliance or sort of amenable to the goals of that movement. And so may we stay ready.
Yeah, my thoughts are really similar to what Fred said, so I won't be too extensive. I'll just say that I think in terms of Black Lives Matter, that movement will continue to be here in some form or fashion as long as there's racial inequality. To go back to Zophia's points about the long arc of Black movement organizing, the question will be, I think, whether people are focused on it, but I don't see that movement going away. And I'd also echo Fred's point about labor unions and the important role that they can play. One of my colleagues at WashU, Jake Rosenfeld, has done an extensive amount of research on this and has shown that the shrinking and demise of labor union influence actually contributes to perpetuating racial wage gaps. That's broadly speaking, but that gives us some insights into what role unions can potentially be playing, depending on how their efforts are organized and marshaled. And similarly, on my own end, I actually don't see the Black Lives Matter movement changing my own research, not because of any negative thoughts about the movement, but because I think that my research has always been oriented around trying to address issues related to race and inequality just in the workplace. So I think of my own work as being very aligned with those overarching goals. So hopefully, if that's how fellow panelists feel, hopefully our work can actually amplify the goals of the movement and really serve to provide academic support and empirical validation for some of the points that they argue.
If I can just add one more point about the unions, I think that we are seeing now why it is so important that we talk about race. There are racist labor unions. And so we need to center that and talk about that and the problems around that as it manifests itself in policing, but also in labor unions more broadly speaking. And because this is part of the reason why we are here, where we are right now. And in terms of the research, I think it just makes it even more clear why, you know, people who were writing about these issues that we tend to ignore in our various subfields are so important that we need to turn to those people today. For example, Du Bois was writing about racist unions for a long, a long time. So we need to recover that. We need to incorporate that into our analyses, and it's just so important and so crucial to what we're doing, what we're studying, and what we're seeing today.
Okay, thank you. We have one more minute. I don't know if any of you want to give a final word.
Just a thank you again for being our moderator, and to everyone for attending.
I thank the three of you for your interventions. I think they were great and have helped us advance our thinking on this movement that is really changing our times. And as Zophia was saying, it's a long struggle for emancipation. And as all of you were saying, it will not end now, it will continue. But as academics, as public intellectuals, we need to find the ways to support and amplify its message. So thank you to the three of you. Thanks to Nitzan for organizing this panel, and to SASE for organizing this panel, and to all the people who participated and who asked questions. Thank you very much.